Before the Category 4 hurricane swallowed the entire coastline, my two sons didn't hesitate. They locked the doors from the outside, cut off all the power, and left me trapped inside with my dog, then said, "Stay and guard the house. Otherwise, the storm will take everything." For 48 hours, I sat in complete darkness. I still don't know how to describe the horror of that storm. When they came back, not a single question about me. The first thing they asked was whether the house was damaged. And in that moment, I understood my value was less than the house. I appreciate you being here with me. One small thing before we start, drop a comment and tell me, have you ever trusted someone with everything only to find out they were working against you, yes or no? I read every one. A few details in this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes. The message behind it, that is what matters most. My name is Walter Gaines, and I was 74 years old the night my sons decided the house was worth saving more than I was. I sat in the hallway closet of my own oceanfront home with my back against the wall and my knees drawn up like a child. Biscuit, my 8-year-old golden retriever, who had been Dorothy's dog, first pressed her graying muzzle into my ribs as if she could hold the roof down by staying close enough, as she was shaking. So was the house. A Category 4 hurricane was tearing across the coast of Rockport, Maine, and the wind was finding every crack in the frame like a burglar testing windows. The power was out. Not because the storm had taken it, my eldest son Derek had cut it before he drove away. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A man's own child walks through the house, flips the main breaker padlocks the utility shed from the outside, and loads the family into 2 cars in the driveway, while the storm warning is already on the radio. He does not knock on my bedroom door. He does not call my name. He locks the shed pockets the key and leaves his 74-year-old father in a house with no power, no phone, and no way to see the water rising under the front door. The flashlight lasted about 6 hours. I rationed it. I would click it on for 10 seconds, check the water level on the hallway floor, check Biscuit, and click it off. In between, I listened. The roof shuddered in waves not steady, like something massive was pressing down on it and letting go, pressing and letting go. The wind did not scream the way people say it does. It moaned, low and constant like a sick animal lying outside the door. Salt water found its way inside somewhere around the 4th hour. I could taste it on my lips before I could see it. I stuffed wet towels under the closet door, with hands that still worked the way they had for 40 years. Hands that had hauled lobster traps and mended nets and built this house board by board with a woman who deserved better than to die 3 years before her husband needed her most. Dorothy Gaines, my wife, retired school librarian, dead at 71 from a cancer that moved faster than the doctors expected. Her handwriting was neat, slanted, and precise, as the woman herself and I recognized it instantly, even in the dying beam of that flashlight, when I found the note tucked behind the emergency radio on the closet shelf. I smiled, not because I was brave, because for the first time in my life, I understood exactly what I was to my own children. The note was short. Dorothy had written it in blue ink on a piece of notebook paper folded twice and taped to the back of the radio, where she knew I would find it only if things got bad enough for me to reach for that shelf. It said, if they ever leave you alone in a storm, Walter opened the envelope. She knew, 3 years dead, and she knew before any of us did. She had watched our sons calculate the value of this house against the cost of keeping me in it, and she had seen the math come out wrong. She left me a note the way a woman leaves a life vest under the seat, hoping you never need it, knowing you will. She knew, girl, I whispered to Biscuit. She knew before any of us did. Biscuit licked my hand once and put her head back down on my thigh. The flashlight died. The darkness was total, as I sat there for another 42 hours. But before I tell you what happened when they came back and found me still breathing, before I tell you about the forged signatures, and the stolen fishing licenses, and the $4.8 million lie that started all of it, tell me something first. Where are you right now? What time is it where you are? Are you driving, lying in bed, sitting in a chair? Your kids bought you for a birthday? They almost forgot. I want to know how far this story travels before my sons realize the truth did not stay locked in that house with me. Now, everything I'm about to tell you is how I remember it. Some conversations are close to exact. Some, I am telling you the way they felt, not the way a recorder would have caught them. I was not wired for sound. I was an old man with a dog in a dark hallway trying to survive a hurricane my family left me in on purpose. So, if the lawyers come calling, that is my answer. This is memory. Memory does not come with timestamps. But let me start from that morning. The last morning, I thought my son still loved me. The fog sat thick on Rockport Harbor. I was mending nets at the pier, Biscuit lying at my feet, and my hands still worked the way they had for 40 years. The lobster traps were stacked. The Miss Dorothy, my 30-foot fishing boat named for the woman who made the coffee I drank every morning for 46 years, was tied and rocking gently in the slip. I did not know that in 12 hours my eldest son would lock me inside my own house and drive away. I did not know. But my dead wife did. Cooper Gaines was 9 years old, and he ran down to the pier that morning like nothing in the world was wrong, because to him, nothing was. His shoes were untied. His jacket was half-zipped. He was my youngest grandchild, and he came sprinting through the fog at 6 in the morning with a message he did not understand he was delivering. Dad said, "Grandpa, you're staying to guard the house," he announced, breathing hard, hands on his knees. "Can I stay too?" I set the net down. Biscuit lifted her head. "Who decided that Coop?" "I don't know. Everybody, I think." Everybody. That word landed on the dock boards and sat there. I looked past the boy toward the parking lot. Derek's car was there at 6 in the morning, engine off, parked at an angle that gave him a clear sight line to the big house on the bluff. My eldest son, Derek Gaines, 48 years old, a beachfront resort broker who had closed more coastal property deals than most agents managed in a career, was sitting behind the wheel, staring at my home with his phone pressed to his ear. Derek did not wake before 8. He did not come to the harbor, and he did not park where he could watch the house unless the house was already on his mind. I sent Cooper back up the hill with a granola bar and a lie about the fog being too thick to fish. Then I sat on the pier and finished the net, because a man who changes his routine is a man who shows his hand. By noon, the fog had burned off, and the storm warning was on every channel. The family gathered in the big house living room, all of them. Derek stood by the coffee table with documents already arranged in front of him, the way he arranged things at closings. Renee Prescott Gaines, his wife 45, a coastal resort consultant who could appraise a room's resale value before she finished crossing its threshold, had already packed 3 cars and booked the Inland Hotel the day before. She sat on the arm of the sofa, with her phone out scrolling through evacuation routes she had screenshotted that morning. Curtis Gaines, my younger son, 44, who managed daily operations at Harborside Marina, with the cautious posture of a man always bracing for someone else's storm, stood near the back door and said nothing. He had his hands in his pockets. He looked at the floor. "Dad, if you stay, we don't have to worry about the house," Derek said. His voice was reasonable. His tone was the one he used on clients who were about to sign something they had not fully read. "Hotels are booked solid anyway. Have you ever sat in a room full of people who love you and realized not one of them is going to say your name, not to ask how you feel, not to ask what you want? Just your name spoken out loud to prove they remember you are a person in the room and not a piece of furniture they are deciding whether to leave behind." Nobody asked me. Nobody said, "Walter, what do you think?" Nobody said, "Dad, are you sure?" The decision had been made before I walked through the door. Cooper had confirmed that at 6 in the morning. This meeting was not a discussion. It was a notification. I looked at Derek's phone on the coffee table. The screen was still lit. It showed a professional coastal broker weather application with Category 4 storm projections dated 2 days earlier. He had known the severity for 48 hours. He had known, and he had packed, and he had told his 9-year-old son that Grandpa was staying before he told Grandpa. By 4 in the afternoon, 3 cars idled in the driveway. The suitcases were loaded. The hotel was confirmed. Patty Ballard Gaines, Curtis's wife. 41, the county tourism board coordinator, whose church committees gave her access to every sympathetic ear in Rockport, squeezed my arm on her way out the door. "Dad, you were always the strong one," she said. She said it the way people say grace before a meal they did not cook. Automatic, practiced, already moving toward the next thing. I watched Derek walk to the utility shed on the east side of the house. The shed housed the breaker panel, the emergency generator hookup, and the main power shutoff for the entire property. He opened the shed door, stepped inside for about 30 seconds, and came back out carrying nothing. Then he closed the door and fastened a padlock through the hasp. The padlock was new, still had the price sticker on it. He had bought it for this. I did not say anything. I stood on the porch and watched. Derek went back inside, walked to the interior panel in the hallway, and flipped the main breaker. The house went dark. Every light, every outlet, the refrigerator, the phone charger, the emergency weather radio plugged into the kitchen wall. All of it gone. He walked out the front door without looking at me. Curtis was the last one out. He turned in the doorway. His mouth opened, then it closed. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he is about to leave behind and knows he will regret. And then he pulled the door shut and walked to his car. 3 engines started. 3 sets of headlights swept across the driveway. The gravel crunched, the gate closed. And then there was nothing but the wind already picking up from the south and Biscuit pressing her nose against my knee in the dark. I stood there for a long time. Then I walked to the kitchen drawer where I kept the flashlight. I pulled it open, reached inside, and my fingers brushed something I had never noticed before. A small folded paper tucked beneath the flashlight, held in place with a single piece of tape. I pulled it free. Even in the dark, I knew the handwriting. Neat. Slanted left. The way Dorothy always wrote. They came back 41 hours later, and the first thing my eldest son checked was the siding. 3 cars pulled into the driveway, with mud-splattered tires and windshields still carrying the grime of the inland highway. Derek got out first. He did not walk toward the porch where I was standing. He turned left and followed the east wall of the house, running his hand along the clapboard, checking the gutters, crouching once to inspect where the foundation met the soil. He made it all the way around before he came inside. Renee followed with her phone out, photographing something near the garage door. Curtis got out. Last stood by his car and looked at the ground. Patty came up the porch steps with both arms open. "Dad, you were so brave staying behind," she said. "The kids would have been terrified." She hugged me the way you hug a coat rack when you're looking for some place to set your purse. Quick, functional, already turning away. Derek called from the side yard. "Siding held. Roof looks good. We got lucky." He said we, as if we had all been in the same storm. Nobody asked if I was hurt. Nobody asked if I had slept or eaten, or how Biscuit had handled the 41 hours of wind that shook the house so hard the closet shelves came down around 2 in the morning. Patty opened the refrigerator and made a face at the smell. Renee walked room to room with her phone taking pictures of things I could not figure a reason to photograph. Curtis stood in the kitchen doorway with his hands in his pockets and would not look at me. There is a kind of cruelty that does not raise its voice. It just walks past you like you are furniture that came with the house. I stood there holding Biscuit's collar and understood something I had been refusing to understand for years. I was not neglected. Neglect implies they forgot. They had not forgotten me. They had inventoried me, weighed me against the property, and decided the siding mattered more. I left around noon, told Derek I was going to the cottage to clean up. He nodded without looking away from his phone. Nobody offered to drive me. Nobody asked if the cottage had power. I walked the quarter mile with Biscuit on her leash, and the sealed envelope from the kitchen drawer inside my coat pocket, pressed against my chest, like a second heartbeat. The cottage was cold. The power had come back on its own sometime during the night. I fed Biscuit-made coffee I would not finish and sat down at the kitchen table beneath the wedding photo. Dorothy and I took in 1977. She was 24 in that picture. I was 27. We looked like 2 people who believed the world would treat them fairly, and for a long time it did. I opened the envelope. 2 pages, cream-colored paper. Neat handwriting slanted, left the way she always wrote. No date, but I knew when she had written it. The paper smelled faintly of lavender hand cream, the kind she used during chemotherapy, when her skin cracked from the treatment. She wrote this in her last year. "Ella Walter? I already spoke to Helen Marsh. The house is yours alone. Don't sign anything. They will ask. They always plan to ask." I read that line 3 times. They always plan to ask. And then I understood. Dorothy did not write this letter because she was afraid of dying. She wrote it because she was afraid of what would happen to me after she did. The second paragraph was harder. "I am sorry I never told you this while I could hold your hand, but you would have defended them. You always do. You would have said Derek is just ambitious and Curtis is just quiet and the girls are just adjusting. You would have made excuses for them until the excuses cost you the house, the boat, and the licenses. I could not let that happen." She drove herself to that lawyer's office, between chemo sessions, without telling me. She sat across from a woman I had never met, and laid out the legal structure that would protect me from my own children, because she knew I would not believe her if she said it out loud. She knew I would argue. She knew I would say the boys would never do that. And she knew with the certainty of a woman who had watched this family longer and more carefully than I had that they absolutely would. The letter ended with a phone number, written in blue ink circled once. Beneath it in smaller letters, "Helen will know what to do. Call her when you are ready. You will know when." I sat at that table for a long time. Biscuit put her head on my knee. The coffee went cold. The wedding photo on the wall showed a woman smiling at a man she loved enough to protect from the worst things she ever learned about their children. Then I picked up the phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the page. It rang twice. "Mr. Gaines, I've been expecting this call," the woman said. Her voice was steady and unhurried the way people sound when they have rehearsed patience for years. "Your wife told me you'd reach out after a storm. Helen Marsh was 58 years old, a maritime attorney whose small office overlooked Rockport Harbor. She had been Dorothy's quiet confidant through the last year of her life. She had drawn up documents I had never seen, filed protections I did not know existed, and waited 3 years for a phone call from a man whose dead wife knew him better than he knew himself. "Mrs. Marsh," I said, "I think my sons are trying to take my house." "I know," she said. "Dorothy told me, and she made sure they can't." Do you know the exact moment your own child started calculating your worth? Helen's words were still ringing in my ears that afternoon. Dorothy had told her everything built a wall of legal paper between my sons and my home, and never said a word to me while she was alive. I sat at the cottage table with the letter in my hand and tried to understand how I had missed it. But that was the wrong question. The right question was when it started. I know the answer. It started at dinner in 2019. Dorothy was still alive then. She had been diagnosed the year before, but was between treatments, and she insisted on cooking that Sunday like nothing had changed. Pot roast with rosemary. The whole family around the big table. Derek brought wine. Curtis brought the kids. For about an hour it felt like the family we used to be. Then Derek leaned back in his chair and said it. "Let me handle the license renewal this season, Dad. Save you the paperwork. I know the forms." He said it the way you offer to carry someone's groceries. Easy, helpful, the kind of thing a good son does. I said yes before the sentence finished leaving his mouth, because that is what I did. My sons asked, and I said yes. I had been saying yes for 48 years. Kindness is the best lockpick. My son learned that the night I handed him the key and smiled while he copied it. Dorothy did not say anything at the table. She cleared the plates. She served the coffee. She hugged the grandchildren goodnight. And then we were in our bedroom, the master bedroom with the ocean window, and she turned off the lamp and lay there in the dark for a long time before she spoke. "You just taught him what those licenses are worth," she said. Her voice was low and firm the way it got when she had been thinking about something for hours and was only now letting it out. "And that you'll say yes if they ask nicely." I told her she was being overprotective. I told her Derek was just trying to help. I told her the licenses were not worth enough to worry about, which was a lie I believed, because believing it was easier than believing my son was inventorying me. She put her hand on my arm in the dark. She did not argue. She never argued when she knew she was right. She just waited. That was her way. She planted the truth and gave it time to grow, and if I was too stubborn to water it, she made other arrangements. I did not understand that until I read her letter 3 years later, but I understand it now. That dinner was the last fully normal meal I remember. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because it was the last time I sat at that table believing everyone in the room loved me more than they loved what I owned. The second memory is harder. By 2021, Dorothy had been gone for a year. I was still living in the big house because it was the only place that still smelled like her if I opened the right closet on the right day. Derek and Renee had moved in 6 months after the funeral, to help, they said, to be closer to family. The displacement happened slowly. A box of my fishing magazines moved from the bedroom to the hallway. My reading chair relocated to the small room at the end of the hall. New sheets appeared on the master bed linen with a scent I did not recognize. My boots disappeared from beside the bedroom door and reappeared by the back entrance near the mudroom. Renee never announced any of it. She just rearranged the way she rearranged everything with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had already decided what the house would look like and was simply waiting for reality to catch up. By September of that year, I was sleeping in the small room, the one with no ocean view, the one Dorothy used to store gift wrap and off-season blankets. I do not remember the exact night I stopped sleeping in my own bedroom. That is how it works. You do not notice the moment they take your place. You only notice when you realize you have been standing somewhere else for months and cannot remember walking there. Sadie Gaines was 12 years old that fall, Curtis's daughter, a girl who had her grandmother's habit of noticing everything and saying almost nothing. She stood in the hallway doorway one afternoon and asked the one question no adult in the house had the honesty to answer. "Grandpa, why do you sleep in the small room? It doesn't even have a window to the water." Renee appeared behind her before I could speak. "He's used to it, sweetheart," she said, laughing easily. "Grandpa doesn't need anything fancy." A 12-year-old girl asked me why I slept in the smallest room of a house I built with my own hands, and I did not have an answer that would not break something inside both of us. So I smiled and told Sadie the small room was cozy. And Renee smiled too, because the lesson had landed exactly where she aimed it. The grandchildren now believed their grandfather did not belong in the master bedroom. The story had been rewritten, and the author never raised her voice. That was Dorothy's room, our room. 35 years of waking up to the sound of the ocean together, and Renee made it sound like I had never belonged there at all. I sat in the cottage now in October 2023, and these memories settled like silt after a current. I looked through the window toward the big house, toward the master bedroom, where Dorothy and I used to lie awake listening to the waves. I wondered what was in that room now, whose things filled the drawers, whose scent was on the pillows. I did not know yet. But when I found out it would be the thing that turned my grief into something with teeth. I was not supposed to hear that conversation, but the back porch carried voices the way the ocean carries sound, farther than anyone expects. This was 8 months before the storm. February 2023. I had come downstairs for water around midnight and stopped at the kitchen door when I heard Derek's voice coming through the screen. He was leaning on the porch railing in the moonlight, his silhouette sharp against the winter sky. Renee stood beside him with her arms crossed. Curtis was not there in person, but his voice glowed from the phone screen propped between them on the railing. They were talking about me. He won't sell voluntarily, Derek said. You know that. And then we need him to have no choice, Renee said. Curtis's tinny voice came through the speaker. What about just waiting? And his bears. We don't have time to wait, Renee said. She said it the way she said everything, like the decision was already made, and the rest of them were just catching up to where she had been standing for weeks. I gripped the cold railing of the kitchen doorframe and stood 6 feet behind them in the dark. My own sons were planning my removal the way a contractor schedules a demolition, not with anger, not with raised voices, with timelines, with logistics, with the calm understanding that the building was in the way and needed to come down. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been erased from a conversation happening inside your own house by people who share your last name? They were not whispering because they were ashamed. They were whispering because they were efficient. Shame would have meant they still thought of me as a person. This was business. I went back upstairs without the water. I lay in the small room at the end of the hall, the one without the ocean view, and stared at the ceiling until the sun came up. I did not confront them the next morning. I did not confront them the morning after that. I told myself I had misunderstood. I told myself Renee was talking about something else. I told myself these things because the alternative was admitting that my children were sitting on my porch in the dark, planning how to take everything I had, and I was too much of a coward to walk out there and say their names. Dorothy would not have hesitated. Dorothy would have opened that screen door and asked them to repeat every word to her face. But Dorothy was dead, and I was the one who was left. And I was not as brave as the woman I married. That was February. The storm came in October. 8 months of silence, 8 months of Sunday dinners and birthday cards, and Derek calling to ask about the boat, while the whole time behind every smile there was a calendar counting down to something I could not see. 3 days after the hurricane, I sat in Helen Marsh's office for the first time. The room was small, lined with maritime law books, harbor light, coming through a window that needed cleaning. Helen sat across from me with a folder open on her desk and a glass of water she had poured before I asked for it. She placed the codicil in front of me. Dorothy's signature at the bottom, steady and clear, despite the treatments that were breaking her body down at the time she signed it. She signed this 8 months before she died, Helen said. Between chemotherapy sessions, she drove herself here alone. She drove herself. Between treatments that left her so exhausted she slept 14 hours afterward, without telling me. Because she knew I would have said they are our children, Dorothy, they would never do this. And she could not bear to hear me be wrong one more time. Both houses, both fishing licenses, the boat, Helen continued. All yours alone. No transfer is valid without your notarized signature while you are mentally competent. She was very specific about that last part. Mentally competent. Dorothy had written those words into a legal document while she was dying because she knew that someday someone in our family would try to argue that I was not. She saw the attack coming from a direction I refused to look. Your wife didn't just leave you a letter, Helen said. Her voice was steady, unhurried, the voice of a woman who had waited 3 years to deliver this and was not going to rush it. She built a wall around everything you own. I sat there and felt the weight of that. My wife, between rounds of poison designed to keep her alive a few more months, had driven herself to this office and spent hours making sure that the man she loved would not lose his home to the children they raised together. She did it in secret. She did it alone. And she did it because she loved me too much to let me defend the people who were already sharpening their knives. Helen reached across the desk and placed a second folder in front of me. This one was thicker. Oh, Walter, there's more, she said. Your son didn't just start asking questions about the house. He filed paperwork with the county 3 weeks before the storm. She opened the folder. I saw Derek's signature on an application I had never seen, never authorized, never knew existed. It was a property transfer inquiry dated the first week of October, and below Derek's signature on the line, marked owner authorization, was my name, in handwriting that was not mine. I stared at it. The letters were close, somebody had practiced, but the slant was wrong, and the G in Gaines had a loop I have never made in my life. Whoever wrote my name on that form had studied my signature, but had not studied it long enough. They started moving 3 weeks before the storm, Helen said quietly. 3 weeks, the porch conversation in February, the county paperwork in October, the padlocked breaker shed, the cars driving away. None of it was impulsive. All of it was scheduled, and the storm was not the beginning. It was the deadline. My eldest son sat across from me 1 week after the storm and offered to buy my house for less than the cost of the land it stood on, and he did it with a smile. The forged signature was still sitting in Helen's office. The county paperwork was still open on her desk. And here was Derek in the living room of the house I built with a fresh folder of documents fanned across the coffee table like a hand of cards he expected to win with. Renee had made coffee. That was the first sign this was rehearsed. Renee did not make coffee for me. She made coffee for closings. She had set 2 mugs on the table, arranged the paperwork at an angle I could read from my chair, and positioned herself on the arm of the sofa where she could watch my face while Derek delivered the pitch. $480,000, Dad, Derek said. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, the posture he used when he wanted to look earnest. That's every dollar we can scrape together. This is a real sacrifice for the family. $480,000 for a house and land worth 10 times that. For 40 years of my life on that coastline, that is $12,000 a year, which is less than I spend on bait. Renee tilted her head. We just want to keep it in the family Walter, she said. That's what Dorothy would have wanted. She used my wife's name the way a locksmith uses a pick, inserting it into the conversation at the precise angle that would make the thing she wanted open up. Dorothy would not have wanted any of this. Dorothy saw it coming and spent her dying months making sure it could not happen. But Renee did not know about the codicil. She did not know about Helen. She did not know that the woman whose name she was borrowing had already outmaneuvered her from beyond the grave. I kept my hands on my knees. I did not pick up the coffee. I did not touch the documents. Let me think about it, I said. Derek smiled. He thought he had won. He thought his 74-year-old father had just folded the way old men fold when their children sit them down with paperwork and speak slowly. He reached across and squeezed my arm the way Patty had squeezed it the day they drove away from the hurricane. Practiced warmth, functional affection, the gesture of a man who had already moved on to the next step in his head. I went home to the cottage and sat with Biscuit and did not think about the offer. I thought about the woman at the Harbor Cafe. She had appeared about 3 weeks before the storm, sat down next to me 2 mornings in a row at the counter, ordered black coffee, and started talking. Nothing suspicious at first. Weather, fishing season, how long I had lived in Rockport. But by the 3rd morning, the questions had edges. How many bedrooms in the big house? Whether the lot went all the way to the water? What the ocean view looked like from the 2nd floor? How many questions does a stranger have to ask you about your own home before you realize they are not making conversation? They are taking inventory. I did not think much of it at the time. People asked about oceanfront property in Maine the way they asked about the weather. It was small talk with a price tag. But I remembered her face, and 2 days after Derek's offer, I saw it again. I was walking past Derek's real estate office on Main Street. The autumn light was sharp and low, the kind that turns every storefront window into a mirror. The door opened, and a woman stepped out holding a folder against her chest. The logo on the folder was visible from 20 feet away, a coastal appraisal company, the name printed in blue above a wave graphic. Sylvia Townsend, 52 years old. A licensed coastal appraiser who had sat next to me at that cafe counter with her questions and her black coffee and her careful, friendly smile. She looked up. Our eyes met across the sidewalk. She looked down first. I did not stop walking. I did not confront her. I memorized the company name on the folder, walked home, and picked up the phone. The woman from the cafe, I told Helen. She works for Derek. I just saw her leaving his office with an appraisal folder. Helen was quiet for a moment. Don't approach her. Let me find out what she filed. If it's what I think it is, we'll need her later. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table. 3 mornings, that woman had sat next to me. 3 mornings of questions I thought were friendly. She had been measuring my house with conversation, calculating square footage from the way I described the rooms, estimating the lot value from the way I talked about the tide line. And I had answered every question because I thought she was being kind. That is what they count on, that men my age will mistake surveillance for friendliness. that we will hand over the blueprints of our lives to anyone who asks nicely enough, because we grew up in a time when people asked questions because they were interested, not because they were building a file. Helen called back that evening. Her voice was different, tighter, more controlled. "Well, Walter, that appraisal company doesn't just do property valuations," she said. "They also do cognitive competency assessments for guardianship filings." I sat down. "Your son didn't hire her to price the house," Helen said. "He hired her to price you." The room was very quiet after that. Biscuit was asleep on the rug. The harbor light was fading through the cottage window, and I understood finally completely what my son had been building since February. Not just a case for the house, a case against my mind. A paper trail that would end with a judge deciding I was no longer competent to own what I had spent my life earning. She was already sitting at our usual table when I arrived, but this time she did not ask a single question about the house. Sylvia Townsend had her hands wrapped around a coffee mug she was not drinking from. The appraisal folder sat on the table between us, like evidence at a trial neither of us had asked for. The harbor boats creaked outside the window. She would not look at me until I sat down. I had spent the night after Helen's call staring at the cottage ceiling, trying to understand the shape of what my son was building. Now the woman who had helped him build it was going to fill in the pieces. "He paid me $3,500 for the valuation," Sylvia said. Her voice dropped when she reached the next part, the way voices drop when people know they are saying something that cannot be taken back. But the email instructions included a second deliverable, a behavioral observation report noting possible cognitive decline in the homeowner. I didn't know that when I took the job. If I let that sentence sit between us. Cognitive decline. My son had hired a stranger to sit next to me at a coffee counter, ask me questions about my own home, and then write a professional report suggesting I was losing my mind. Every conversation we'd had, the lot sizes. The ocean views, the room counts was not small talk. It was a clinical assessment dressed in friendliness. "He's building a guardianship case, Mr. Gaines," Sylvia said. "That's what the cognitive decline report is for. If a judge grants it, your son becomes your legal decision maker. He signs for you. He sells for you. You don't get a vote." "Did you send the report?" I asked. "Not yet, but they're expecting it by Friday." They were not just trying to take my house. They were trying to take my mind, or at least convince a judge I had already lost it. Every piece of the plan connected now. The lowball offer was not meant to succeed. It was meant to be refused. And when I refused it, Derek would file the guardianship petition attached Sylvia's report and argue that my refusal to sell a multi-million-dollar property for a fraction of its value was proof that I could no longer make sound financial decisions. The refusal was the evidence. He had designed the trap so that saying no was the thing that would destroy me. I thanked Sylvia. She looked like she wanted to say more, but could not find the words. I left my coffee untouched on the table and walked out into the October air. That afternoon, I used my spare key to enter the big house. The family was away, Derek at his office, Renee at some showing Curtis at the marina. The house was quiet in a way that felt staged like a museum after closing. I walked through the kitchen, past the living room, where Derek had made his offer down the hallway to the master bedroom. I had not been inside that room in over 2 years. Not since the months after Dorothy died, when Renee's gradual rearrangement had pushed me down the hall and into the small room. I had avoided the door the way you avoid places that hold too much of someone you have lost. I was not ready. I am not sure I was ready now, but I turned the knob and pushed the door open. There are rooms in a house that are not rooms. They are altars. Places where the most important moments of your life happened, where the air still holds the shape of the person who filled it. Dorothy and I slept in that room for 35 years. She died in the bed in that corner, with the window open so she could hear the ocean one more time. The bed was new. King-sized white duvet, decorative pillows stacked in a pattern no one who actually sleeps there would maintain. New nightstands. A candle on the dresser that smelled like lavender, but not like Dorothy's lavender synthetic hotel suite, the kind of scent designed to make strangers feel welcome in a room that does not belong to them. On the nightstand propped against a small vase of dried flowers was a laminated card. I picked it up. The surface was smooth and cold between my fingers. Captain's room, oceanfront Maine, $340 per night. They had turned the room where my wife died into a vacation rental. I stood there holding that card and felt something shift inside my chest. Not breaking, not cracking, something locking into place. The grief I had been carrying for 3 years, the soft, shapeless weight of missing Dorothy, hardened into something with edges. Something I could use. Biscuit had followed me into the house, but she would not cross the bedroom threshold. She stood in the doorway with her head low and looked at me the way she looked at Dorothy's empty chair for weeks after the funeral. She knew this room. She knew what had been taken from it, and she would not step inside the version that had replaced it. I set the laminated card back on the nightstand. I did not touch the sheets. I did not open the closet. I pulled the door shut slowly, the way you close a casket, and held the knob for a long moment before letting go. That evening, I sat in the cottage with Biscuit at my feet. Dorothy's letter was on the kitchen table where I had left it. I placed the Airbnb card next to it, 2 pieces of paper, one written by the woman who loved me most in this world, the other placed on the nightstand where she drew her last breath by the woman who married my son and saw a revenue stream where a widow's memory should have been. I picked up my phone and texted Helen 2 words. I'm ready. The evidence I needed most came from a 12-year-old girl who did not know she was carrying it. Helen had replied to my text within minutes that night. We had a plan forming a counter-strategy taking shape. But the next piece did not come from a lawyer's office or a county filing. It came from a family dinner I almost did not attend. Early November, the family gathered at the big house the way they always did, as if nothing had changed, as if no one in the room was building a legal case to erase me. Renee cooked. Patty set the table. Derek poured wine and asked about the boat like a man who had not recently tried to buy my life for pennies on the dollar. I sat and ate and said very little, which is what they expected from me, which is what made it easy. Sadie was at the table with her tablet propped against a water glass, the way kids eat now, half in the room, half somewhere else. After dinner, she set the tablet face up on the kitchen counter and ran outside to play with Cooper in the last of the daylight. The screen had not locked. I was clearing my plate. I glanced down. The email application was open. The subject line read, Guardianship Filing, Gaines Walter R. Preliminary Assessment. My full name, my middle initial, a case number. My own son had given me a case number. I did not pick up the tablet. I leaned over it just long enough to read 3 lines of the email chain. The sender was a Portland attorney I had never heard of. The phrases were clinical and precise. Diminished capacity, asset protection transfer, behavioral observations consistent with early cognitive decline. Diminished capacity. That is what my son wrote about me in an email to a lawyer I had never met. Diminished capacity as if 40 years of reading tides and pulling traps before dawn were the work of a man who could not think straight. As if navigating a 30-foot boat through fog and current required less mental sharpness than filling out the paperwork to take someone's home. I set the tablet face down exactly where Sadie had left it. I finished clearing the dishes. I said goodnight to the family with the same voice I always used. Then I walked to my car, pulled out of the driveway, and called Helen before I reached the main road. They filed the paperwork, I said. I saw it on Sadie's tablet, a Portland lawyer, guardianship. Did they see you read it? No, I put it back exactly where it was. Good, Helen said. Don't change anything. Don't act differently. Let them think you don't know. I drove home in the dark and did not sleep. The next morning I was sitting in Dr. Alma Cho's office. She was 55 years old, had been my physician for 22 years, and could recite my blood pressure history from memory. She closed the office door and told me to sit down, and I knew from the way she said it that this was not a routine visit. Your son came in last Tuesday, she said. Her voice was steady, clinical, the voice she used when she was delivering difficult news and wanted the facts to land without distortion. He wanted me to sign a form confirming early signs of cognitive decline, based on his wife's observations, not mine. She paused to let that settle. I've been your doctor for 22 years, Walter. There is nothing wrong with your mind. I told him that, and he left without another word. I sat in the vinyl chair and felt the armrests cold under my hands. Derek had walked into my doctor's office and asked her to certify that his father was losing his mind. He had brought Renee's observations as evidence, not medical records, not test results. His wife's descriptions of an old man she had already decided was in the way. How do you fight someone who is trying to erase you, not from a house, not from a will, but from your own legal existence? A guardianship does not just take your property. It takes your signature, your voice, your right to say yes or no to anything that happens to you. It turns you into a ward, a file, a case number on a Portland attorney's desk. But they'll find someone, Dr. Cho said. She took off her glasses and set them on the desk the way she did when she was no longer speaking as my physician, but as someone who had known me long enough to be honest. In Portland, there are doctors who will sign a cognitive decline form based on family testimony alone. No personal examination, no history review. If your son finds one of those doctors, you could lose the right to make any legal decisions, including about the house. I thanked her. She squeezed my hand at the door, which she had never done before in 22 years of appointments. That squeeze told me more than anything she had said. She was worried. I stood in the parking lot with the November wind cutting through my jacket and the gray sky pressing down on everything. I dialed Helen. "They're looking for a doctor in Portland," I said. "One who will sign without seeing me." Helen was quiet for 2 seconds. In the months I had known her, I had learned that her silences were not empty. They were calculations. "Then we need to move faster than they do, Walter." I nodded to no one. The wind pulled at my collar. Somewhere inside the clinic, Dr. Cho was probably writing notes in my file notes that would matter. Later notes that would prove a 22-year physician found nothing wrong with the man his own family was trying to declare incompetent. "Oh, then I need to move faster than they do," I said, and I meant it. Earl Hobson had the footage queued up before I even sat down. He had been waiting for me to ask. Moving faster meant gathering what I could not get from lawyers or letters. It meant going to the people who had been watching when I was not. Earl was the first. He was 71 years old, a retired Coast Guard petty officer who ran the bait shop at the end of the pier and kept 3 security cameras running at all times because 30 years of watch duty had wired him to record everything and trust nothing. His house smelled like coffee and old rope, and the faint chemical residue of bait that never fully washes out of a building. He sat me down in front of his computer, clicked the mouse twice, and let the footage play. The timestamp read 6:07 a.m., October morning. The harbor parking lot grainy, but clear enough. Derek's car was parked at the far end, angled toward the road that climbed up to the bluff and the big house. He stood outside the driver's door with his phone to his ear, his free hand pointing at my house. Renee sat in the passenger seat with the window down, nodding. 4 hours before the family meeting. 4 hours before Derek stood in my living room and made it sound like staying behind was a group decision. He was already in that parking lot at 6 in the morning, coordinating with his wife, pointing at the building he intended to leave me inside. 6:07. I watched my son point at my house like a man marking a structure for demolition. And beside him, my daughter-in-law nodded the way you nod when a contractor confirms a delivery date. "He knew before he came home that morning," Earl said. He leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, the posture of a man who had spent decades filing incident reports and understood that evidence does not need emotion to do its work. The decision was made in that parking lot. "Can you save that file?" I asked. "Already done. 3 copies. 1 for you, 1 for your lawyer, 1 stays with me." He tapped the side of his monitor. "Old Coast Guard habit. You never keep evidence in just one place." I took the flash drive he offered and put it in my coat pocket next to the letter and the Airbnb card. My pocket was becoming an archive of betrayal, each piece small enough to hold in one hand, each one heavy enough to change everything. Earl poured me a cup of coffee that was strong enough to strip paint off a hole. I drank it because refusing it would have been an insult to a man who had just handed me proof that my son planned my abandonment before breakfast. I left Earl's house with 3 copies of The Truth and drove back to the cottage. The sky was November gray, pressing down on the rooftops the way it does in Maine when the season is turning and the light gives up early. I sat in the kitchen and looked at what I had. Dorothy's letter, the codicil, Sylvia's confession, Dr. Cho's refusal, the forged county paperwork, and now Earl's footage. The case was building itself. Each person I talked to held a piece they did not know was connected to the others. Earl had the footage, Dr. Cho had the refusal, Sylvia had the appraisal angle, Helen had the legal structure Dorothy built. None of them had seen the full picture until I started putting the edges together. But one piece was still missing. The thing I had been circling since February. Renee's voice on the porch in the dark. "We don't have time to wait." What was the deadline? What was driving the urgency that made my son willing to leave me in a hurricane, forge my signature, and try to have me declared incompetent all within the same year? I did not have that answer yet, but I knew someone who might. Late that night, I called Nate Fielder. He was 58 years old, had fished beside me for 30 years, and never once needed to be told where to set the traps. He answered on the first ring. I told him everything, from the beginning. The storm, the locked shed, the darkness, Dorothy's letter, the codicil, the lowball offer, Sylvia and the guardianship filing, the Airbnb card in the room where my wife died, Dr. Cho's warning, Earl's footage, all of it. I talked for close to an hour, and he did not interrupt once. I had spent 40 years fishing beside Nate Fielder, and never once asked him for help with anything larger than a tangled line. That night, I asked him to hold the whole truth, and he did not flinch. When I finished, there was a long silence. I could hear him breathing. Then he spoke. I saw Derek's truck at the marina at 6 that morning, Nate said. His voice was quiet the way it got when he was angry and trying not to show it. Thought nothing of it. I should have told you. A second witness, a second pair of eyes confirming what Earl's camera had captured. Derek at the harbor at 6 in the morning, on the day of the storm, hours before anyone told me I was staying behind. What are you going to do? Walters, Nate asked. I looked at the kitchen table. Dorothy's letter, the Airbnb card, Earl's flash drive, the phone warm in my hand from an hour of talking, Biscuit breathing slowly at my feet in the dark cottage. Everything she told me to do, I said. I hung up and sat there for a long time. I had the letter, the codicil, the footage, a witness, a lawyer. But I did not yet have the one thing that would explain why Derek could not wait. The hidden engine behind all of it. Renee's words from the porch still hung in the air like a question without an answer. We don't have time to wait. Tomorrow I would find out why. Harlan Voss was 79 years old and remembered everything, including things my own son hoped the whole town had forgotten. The answer to Renee's deadline was not in a lawyer's office or a county filing. It was in a rope-filled shed at the old harbor, told by a man who had fished these waters longer than anyone alive. Harlan had wanted that 4-acre parcel himself 38 years ago. He told me that straight out leaning against the doorframe of his shed with his arms folded across a chest that still looked like it could haul a 100-pound trap. He was not a hospitality man. He did not offer coffee. He offered the truth which was more useful. A Boston family wanted your land before you bought it, Harlan said. His voice was slow and deliberate, the voice of a man who had spent decades making decisions on open water and never learned to rush. 38 years ago, you got there 1 week ahead of them. They offered your father double. He turned them down because he liked you more than he liked money. I knew that part. My father had told me the story once the year before he died. What I did not know was what came next. That family's son is the one Derek is talking to now, Harlan said. Same parcel, same interest, different generation. Your boy has been telling people the buyer gave him a 60-day window. Offer expires, walk away, never comes back. He paused and let the rope creak on the hooks above us. That family waited 38 years, Walter. They are not walking away in 60 days. There is no expiration. Your son made that up. A man who invents a deadline is a man already running from one. I just did not yet know what was chasing my son. The Boston family had patience measured in decades. They would wait another year, another 5. The urgency was not coming from the buyer. It was coming from Derek. Something was pressing on him, something with a real clock, a real consequence, and he had wrapped it inside a fake deadline to make it look like the pressure was external. Why can't Derek wait? I asked. Harlan shook his head. That's the question you need Helen to answer, because a man who fabricates a deadline is a man who already has one. I sat on the rough bench in that shed and felt the shape of the conspiracy shift again. Every time I thought I understood the edges, another corner appeared. The storm was not the beginning. The porch conversation in February was not the beginning. This went back further to a calculation my son had been running, long before I heard Renee whisper in the dark. I thanked Harlan. He nodded once the way fishermen acknowledge things that do not require more words. I walked back along the harbor toward the net storage, and that is where the second truth of the day found me. Rowan Cahill was 42, the marina bookkeeper, who noticed every number that did not add up, because that was literally what they paid him to do. He came through the net storage with a folder under his arm, walking quickly and looking over his shoulder, the way people do when they know they should not be having the conversation they are about to have. Mr. Gaines, I need to talk to you before Curtis comes back, he said. Curtis, my younger son, the quiet one, the one who stood at doorways and said nothing. The one I had been telling myself was merely weak, merely pulled along by Derek's gravity, merely unable to say no. Your son Curtis transferred $47,000 from the Marina Operations account to an LLC registered in Delaware, Rowan said. He opened the folder and held it so I could see the wire transfer record. Curtis's signature was at the bottom, clear and steady. 3 weeks before the storm, his signature is on the wire. $47,000, a Delaware LLC. 3 weeks before the storm. My younger son had not been dragged into this. He had bought a seat at the table. Does Curtis know you're telling me? I asked. He thinks I'm on vacation this week, Rowan said. I came back early because the numbers were keeping me up at night. That transfer went through an account I reconcile every month. It was hidden in a line item labeled maintenance supplies. $47,000 in maintenance supplies, Mr. Gaines. That's not a mop and bucket. I had told myself Curtis was passive. That he followed Derek the way a smaller boat follows the wake of a larger one, not by choice, but by current. I had believed that because believing it let me keep one son in the category of redeemable. But weak men do not open LLCs in states they have never visited. Weak men do not sign wire transfers and bury them inside maintenance budgets. Curtis had done the math, signed the paper, and moved the money. That is not weakness. That is participation. I took the folder. Rowan nodded and walked back through the net storage without another word. The harbor gulls circled overhead in the November gray, indifferent to the wreckage assembling itself below them. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat and the steering wheel cold under my palms. 2 new truths stacked on top of every truth that came before. Derek's deadline was fabricated, but his desperation was real. Curtis was not a bystander. He was invested literally. I pulled into the cottage driveway, left the engine running, and called Helen. I need to know what Derek owes, and to whom, I said. Because everyone around him is moving like a man who is about to lose everything. Helen was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had that tightness I had learned to recognize the sound of a lawyer who has found something she was not expecting to find. Come in tomorrow morning, she said. I found something in the county records that explains all of it. Helen had 2 folders on her desk that morning, one she expected to show me, and one she wished she did not have to. I had driven to her office before the sun cleared the tree line, the way you drive to an appointment you have been dreading and needing in equal measure. She told me on the phone she had found something in the county records. Now she was going to show me what it was. The first folder was thin. She opened it and placed a single document in front of me. It was an application to transfer my Zone A commercial fishing license to an LLC I had never heard of. At the bottom, on the line, marked Owner Authorization, was a signature that was supposed to be mine. It was not mine. Is that your handwriting? Helen asked. She already knew the answer. She was asking for the record. No, I said. That is not my handwriting. The signature was close. Whoever wrote it had studied the way I make my letters, but the slant was the same wrong slant I had seen on the county paperwork weeks earlier. The G in my last name had that loop again, the loop I have never made in my life. My son had practiced my name, and he had practiced it enough to fool a clerk, but not enough to fool the man who actually writes it. Then this isn't just about the house anymore, Walter, Helen said. She took off her glasses and set them on the desk. He forged your signature on a federal fishing license. That's a federal crime. My son forged my name. He sat somewhere at a desk at a kitchen table in the front seat of his car, and he practiced writing my signature until it looked close enough to send to a government office. That takes patience. That takes repetition. That takes a kind of coldness I had never imagined living inside my own blood. You do not forge your father's name by accident. You do it by deciding he is no longer your father. He is an obstacle, a line item, a signature you need on a form. Helen told me the application had landed on Commissioner Farley Knox's desk, but had not been approved. The signature looked wrong to Farley, and he had set it aside. That was the only reason my fishing license was still mine, because a county commissioner trusted his eyes more than the paperwork. That afternoon, I drove to the county administration building in Rockland. The hallways smelled like floor wax and recycled air. Commissioner Farley Knox was 63 years old, had chaired the Commercial Fishing License Board for over a decade, and still remembered the night I hauled his sinking vessel to shore in a nor'easter 20 years ago. He sat across from me in his office under fluorescent lights and placed the forged application between us on the desk. 3 years ago, your son tried to transfer that small coastal plot to another LLC, Farley said. He turned the application over in his weathered hands like a man handling something he wished he had never received. Different company name, same structure. I rejected it for missing paperwork. I should have told you then. I'm sorry, Walter. 3 years? He had been doing this for 3 years. While I cooked him dinner, while I taught his son to bait a hook, while I sat in the small room they had moved me to and told myself things would get better. Derek was filing paperwork to take everything I owned, one attempt at a time, one forged signature at a time, testing the system the way a man tests a lock, applying pressure at different points until something gives. How many times has he done this? I asked. Twice that I know of, Farley said, but I only see what comes through my office. Twice through his office. The fishing license was a third. The county property transfer Helen had shown me weeks ago was a fourth, and those were only the ones we had found. The thought of what we had not found sat in my stomach like a stone. Don't approve anything with my name on it until I stand in front of you and confirm it myself, I said. Anything. Farley nodded. He wrote a note on a yellow pad and initialed it, That note in a county commissioner's handwriting would matter later, but I did not know that yet. I drove back to Helen's office as the afternoon light faded. She had spent the hours while I was gone, spreading every document we had across her desk. The forged license application, the prior land transfer attempt, the guardianship filing from the Portland attorney, Earl's camera footage on a flash drive, the wire transfer record Rowan had given me, the codicil Dorothy signed between chemotherapy sessions, all of it arranged in chronological order, covering every inch of the desk. She looked at me when I walked in. "There's one piece left," she said. "The reason he can't wait." She opened the second folder, the one she wished she did not have to show me. She slid a single page across the desk. It was a loan document, 11 years old. A resort development project that had failed before the first foundation was poured. The borrower was an LLC with Derek's name on the articles. The amount was $420,000. The loan had defaulted been sold to a professional debt collection firm, and the new creditor had recently located the guarantor listed on the original paperwork. The guarantor's name was mine. In handwriting, that was not. $420,000. 11 years ago, my son had borrowed nearly $500,000 for a project that never existed and signed my name as the man who would pay if he could not. The debt had been wandering through the collection system for over a decade, and it had finally found its way home. "That's why he can't wait," Helen said quietly. "He has 90 days before they file criminal forgery charges. The clock started 3 months ago. The loan was 11 years old, and the debt was mine in name only, but the consequences were about to become very real." Helen had laid it out the night before, but sitting in her office the next morning with the document in front of me, I needed to hear it again. Not because I did not understand, because understanding it required accepting something about my son that I had spent a lifetime refusing to see. The resort project never broke ground, Helen said. She had the full file now pulled from court records and debt transfer documents she had spent the night tracing. The LLC folded within a year. The loan defaulted. It sat in a collection pool for nearly a decade, bought and sold twice until a new firm acquired it and started tracking down the guarantor. And the guarantor is me. Your name. Your forged signature. The collection firm doesn't know it's forged, they just know you're listed. Derek has 90 days from the date of notice to repay before they escalate to criminal forgery charges against whoever signed the original. The storm, the guardianship, the fishing license, the lowball offer, the staged bedroom. All of it, every piece connected to a single loan taken out when I was 63 years old, and did not know my name was being written on a document I would not see for over a decade. So the hurricane, the guardianship filing the forged license, all of it was because of this loan, I asked. All of it, Helen said. He needs to sell your property fast enough to cover the debt before the collection firm files. That's why the fake deadline. That's why the Boston buyer. That's why he can't wait. 11 years. He had been carrying that debt like a man walking on a frozen lake every step, careful every step, hoping the ice would hold. And when it started to crack, he decided to stand on me instead. He did not come to me and confess. He did not ask for help. He built a machine designed to strip me of my home, my licenses, my legal rights, and my dignity, so that he could sell what I owned and pay a bill I never agreed to. Time is on your side now, Helen said. Not his. Every day that passes without a sale is a day closer to those charges. He's the one running out of room. I sat with that. The man I raised the boy who used to ride on my shoulders down to the harbor had spent 11 years hiding a crime inside my name, and was now dismantling my life to keep it hidden. I do not know what is worse, the theft or the patience it required. Helen asked if I wanted coffee. I shook my head. I had not eaten since the night before. The knowledge was taking up all the space inside me, and there was no room for anything else. Later that week, I was at the harbor mending a line on the Miss Dorothy when a voice called my name from the dock. Bev Norris was 67, a retired postal worker who had been Dorothy's closest friend for 40 years. She walked toward me, holding a worn envelope against the November wind, and the look on her face told me she had been waiting for the right moment to deliver it. Dorothy sent me a copy, Bev said. She held the envelope out with both hands the way you hand someone something fragile. She said, "In case Walter never opens the original. She knew you, Walter. She knew you'd think of it as saying goodbye again." She had prepared for the possibility that I would love her too much to read her last words. Even in dying, she was thinking 2 steps ahead of my grief. She knew that opening that envelope in the kitchen drawer would feel like losing her one more time, and she knew I might choose the grief of not knowing over the pain of reading her goodbye. So she sent a backup to the one person she trusted to bring it to me when the time was right. I took the envelope. It was soft from 3 years in a nightstand drawer, the edges worn round. Inside was a copy of the same letter, the same handwriting, and one additional note that had not been in the original. She told me once, Bev said, pulling her coat tighter against the harbor wind. She said, he offered to manage the fishing licenses 2 years ago. I told Walter to say no. He said yes to be kind. That's when Derek learned everything. Dorothy had seen it, the dinner, in 2019, the moment I said yes to Derek's offer and handed him the key to everything I owned. She had told me that night in the dark bedroom what it meant, and I had dismissed her. She had gone to Helen. She had signed the codicil. She had written the letter. She had sent the backup to Bev. And she had done all of it knowing I would not listen, knowing I would defend my sons until the defense cost me everything, and loving me enough to build the wall anyway. She knew me better than I knew myself, I said. Bev nodded. The gulls circled overhead. The harbor smelled like cold salt and diesel, the smell of every November I could remember. Bev touched my arm once the way Dorothy used to and walked back up the dock without another word. I stood there for a long time with the envelope in my coat pocket. I had every piece now. The motive, the evidence, the legal protections Dorothy built, the camera footage, the witnesses, the forged signatures, the loan, the deadline, all of it. But I had not made my first move yet. I had been gathering, listening, collecting pieces from people who held truths they did not know were connected. Tomorrow, that changes. Sadie was coming for dinner at the cottage, and she had something to tell me about her parents, something about a fight she overheard, something that would show me exactly how far Curtis had been pushed and how close he was to breaking. Sadie stood in my doorway holding a casserole dish like a shield, and I knew before she said a word that something in her house had broken. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Her jacket was zipped to the chin, even though the cottage was warm. She set the dish on my kitchen table and sat down without taking off her coat, which is something a 12-year-old only does when she is not sure she is staying. I poured her a glass of water and sat across from her. I did not ask what happened. I waited. Dorothy always said the fastest way to get someone to talk is to stop asking them to. Mom was screaming, Sadie said. Her voice cracked on the last word. She said, "You either sign with Derek or I take the kids and go to my mother's." Dad just sat there. Patty, Curtis's wife, the woman who squeezed my arm on the porch the day the family drove away from the hurricane and called it love. She had given her husband an ultimatum sign with Derek, or lose your children. Not a negotiation, not a discussion, a threat delivered at volume in a house where a 12-year-old could hear every word. "What, did your dad look sad?" I asked. "He looked like he wanted to say something, but didn't know how," Sadie said. "I know that feeling, sweetheart. I know it exactly." Curtis was not being pulled in two directions. He was being squeezed from one, and the woman doing the squeezing had promised to take his children if he did not comply. I had spent months telling myself Curtis was passive, that he followed Derek because he lacked the spine to resist. But Patty's ultimatum changed the picture. Curtis was not weak by nature. He was being hollowed out by a woman who had turned their marriage into a lever and their children into the fulcrum. I made Sadie a plate from the casserole she brought. She barely ate. I told her she could come to the cottage anytime, no reason needed, no questions asked. She nodded and left. An hour later, looking slightly less like a girl carrying a weight she should never have been handed. The following Sunday, I went to Rockport Community Church. I arrived early, sat through the service, and stayed after. Not because I needed the sermon, because I needed to see who Patty was talking to. Pastor Glenn Whitfield was 61 years old and had led this church for 19 years. He knew every family in the congregation. He had officiated Dorothy's funeral. He had shaken my hand every Sunday for as long as I could remember, and never once looked at me like a man who was losing his mind. You want to know what betrayal sounds like in a church hallway? It sounds like concern. It sounds like a woman lowering her voice and saying she is worried. The organ postlude was still playing when I walked toward the fellowship hall to get coffee. I turned the corner and stopped. Patty was standing in the hallway with the pastor. Her back to me, her voice pitched at that careful frequency people use when they want to sound compassionate while doing something cruel. "I'm worried about Walter Pastor," she said. "He's been acting strangely since the storm, making threats, refusing to talk to the family. We don't know what to do." The pastor's face was creased with concern. He nodded slowly. "That doesn't sound like the Walter I know," he said. "Has anyone spoken to his doctor?" "We're trying," Patty said, "but he won't listen to any of us." She was building a case. Not in a courtroom, in a congregation. She was planting the narrative that I was unstable, erratic, possibly declining, the same story Derek was trying to sell to a Portland doctor. now being seated into the one community where my reputation mattered most. If the guardianship filing ever reached a hearing, Patty wanted the pastor ready to testify. She wanted church members whispering that poor Walter had not been himself since the storm. She was constructing a reputation in reverse, starting with the conclusion and building the evidence backward. And she had no idea I was standing 12 feet behind her. I did not step forward. I did not confront her. I stood in the dim hallway under the fluorescent lights and let her finish. I watched the pastor nod. I watched Patty touch his arm, the way she touched mine on the porch that practiced purposeful warmth, that meant nothing and accomplished everything. And then I looked up. Above the cork fellowship board mounted near the ceiling, where most people never think to look, was a small black security camera. A red light blinked once. I left the church without speaking to anyone. I walked across the parking lot in the November cold, found the payphone outside the gas station on Harbor Street dropped in a quarter, and dialed Helen. She picked up on the second ring. "Patty is at the church," I said. "She just told Pastor Whitfield that I've been acting erratically since the storm, making threats, refusing family contact. She's building a character case through the congregation." I could hear Helen breathing, processing. "There's a security camera in the hallway," I said, "above the fellowship board. If it has audio, she just recorded herself building a defamation case on church property." Helen was quiet for 3 seconds. In the months I had known her, I had learned that her silences meant she was already 5 moves ahead. "If that camera has audio, we have everything we need from her," Helen said. "But I need you to do something else first. Derek just sent Curtis a text message. I have a screenshot. You need to see it before tomorrow morning." I hung up the payphone and stood in the parking lot. The church bells were still ringing behind me. The November air cut through my jacket. Inside that building, a woman I had welcomed into my family was telling a pastor I had known for 2 decades that I was losing my mind, and 12 feet above her head, a camera had been watching the whole time. The text came in at 6:47 in the morning on a Tuesday. The phone buzzed against the wooden nightstand and lit the cottage bedroom in that cold blue glow that means someone has decided your day for you before you have opened your eyes. Helen had warned me the night before that Derek sent Curtis something threatening, but this text was not to Curtis. This one was to me. "Dad, the fishing board owes me a favor. Licenses can get complicated when the right people start asking questions about mental competency. Think about the offer." I read it twice. Then I screenshotted it, because a fisherman who has spent 40 years pulling traps knows that the thing you catch is only as valuable as the proof you kept it. I called Helen. She answered before the second ring. "Read it to me," she said, slowly. I read it. She was quiet for a long time. "Read it again." I read it again. "Good," she said. Her voice had that precision it took on when something had shifted in her favor, and she was already calculating how far the shift would carry. "He put it in writing. That's extortion on top of forgery. Don't respond. Don't delete it. And Walter, don't smile yet." I was not smiling. I was sitting in the dark cottage holding a phone that contained a threat from my eldest son, a man who used to hold my hand, crossing the street to the harbor when he was 4 years old. That man had just texted me before sunrise, threatening to use his connections to strip my fishing licenses by questioning my mental competency. He typed it with his own thumbs. He pressed send. He thought it was leverage. When did my son learn that threatening a man's livelihood was just another negotiation tactic, and who taught him that was acceptable? Was it the resort deals, the years of closing on properties where someone always lost? Or was it something older, something in him that Dorothy saw? And I refused to something that made her drive herself to a lawyer's office between chemotherapy sessions to build a wall I did not yet know I needed. Before I tell you what happened next, before I show you the document that turned this whole thing around, I need to ask you something. Comment. Your honest read was, "My son desperate," or "Was he always this way?" Just a few words. I want to know how this lands before I go further. And please note, the next part includes some details shaped for storytelling to capture what this felt like from where I was standing. The truth underneath is what matters. Helen filed the screenshot that morning. Then she opened a second document on her desk, the one she had been drafting since I texted her those 2 words from the cottage kitchen. The formal lease agreement. $3,800 a month, Helen said. She turned the document so I could read it. Market rate for a 4-bedroom oceanfront property. Only Derek and Curtis are named as tenants. Renee and Patty are not on this lease. She let that settle. If they want legal standing in that house, they'll have to ask their husbands why they don't have it. The lease was clean, payment deadlines, maintenance responsibilities, a clause prohibiting unauthorized occupants, and on the tenant line, 2 names my son's and 2 conspicuous absences. Renee, who had orchestrated the bedroom displacement and the vacation rental. Patty, who had given Curtis an ultimatum and was building a defamation case through the church. Neither of them existed on this document. They had spent months treating my house as their asset, and now a single piece of paper proved they had no claim to it at all. Renee's name was not on the lease. Neither was Patty's. Two women who had spent months orchestrating the sale of a house they had no legal right to occupy, and now the paper made that fact undeniable. Helen sent the lease by certified mail that afternoon. I sat in her office and waited. The call came 3 hours later. Derek's voice was tight, cracking between outrage and something I had not heard from him before, uncertainty. "What is this, Dad? You're charging us rent in our mother's house." He said our mother's house, as if the woman who built legal protections against him from her deathbed would have wanted him to live there for free while he forged my name on federal documents. "It's a lease," I said. "You have 30 days to sign or vacate." I hung up. The click of that phone being set down on Helen's desk was the first offensive move I had made since the storm. Everything before this had been gathering, listening, collecting, absorbing blow after blow, while the evidence assembled itself from pieces held by different people. This was different. This was a document with my name on it, sent by my lawyer, telling my sons they no longer controlled the terms of their presence in my home. Helen looked at me across the desk. Neither of us spoke for 4 seconds. "There's one more thing," she said. "Sylvia called my office this morning. She wants to meet, alone without Derek knowing." I waited. "She says she has information about the fishing license forgery that changes everything." Sylvia, the appraiser who had sat next to me at the Harbor Cafe, measuring my house with conversation. The woman who had confessed the guardianship angle and then disappeared back into Derek's orbit. She was calling Helen now, asking for a private meeting, offering information she should not have if she were still loyal to the man who hired her. Something had shifted. People do not break from the winning side. They break when they realize the side they chose is going to lose. And Sylvia, who had seen the inside of Derek's operation closer than anyone, had apparently decided which direction this was heading. I picked up my coat. Helen was already reaching for her calendar. She was already waiting when I reached the dock at 5 in the morning, and that told me everything I needed to know about how afraid she was of being seen. Sylvia Townsend stood at the far end of the pier, where the harbor lights barely reached her coat, pulled tight, the valuation report held against her chest like armor. The water lapped against the pilings in the December darkness. Diesel and cold salt hung in the air. She did not say hello. She held out the folder. "The full valuation," she said. Her voice dropped the way it does when a person knows they are handing over something that cannot be taken back. "House and land, $4.8 million. I opened the report under the dock light. The number was printed on the cover page in bold type. $4.8 million. The property my sons had offered to buy for a fraction of that. The home I built with Dorothy board by board over 46 years. The land my father chose over a higher bid because he liked the man I was more than the money someone else offered. Derek is negotiating with a Boston resort group," Sylvia said. "The offer is $4.1 million. Curtis gets $180,000 to stay quiet. The rest goes to Derek and the debt. $700,000. That was the discount my son was willing to accept on my life's work, so he could cover a debt I never agreed to carry. He was planning to sell the property below its value because speed mattered more than price, and he was paying Curtis less than 4% of the total to keep his mouth shut. Derek was not just stealing from me. He was stealing from his own brother and calling it a partnership. I didn't know about the guardianship filing when I took the job," Sylvia said. "I'm sorry, Mr. Gaines." I looked at her. She was shivering, and not from the cold. There is a particular look people get when they realize they have been working inside a machine they did not understand until it was too late. Sylvia had that look. She had taken a job appraising a house and discovered she was helping dismantle a man's life. "And $4.8 million, I said. She always knew what this place was worth. Dorothy. Who saw the value of that coastline before the market did? Who built the legal wall to protect it? Who sent backup copies and backup plans and backup people because she understood that the threat was not the ocean or the weather. The threat was family. I took the report. Sylvia walked back up the pier without looking over her shoulder. I stood there in the pre-dawn dark with the December wind numbing my fingers and the full scope of my son's plan laid out in a document that smelled like printer ink and betrayal. 2 weeks later, on day 27 of 30, both signed leases arrived at Helen's office. Derek's came first by certified mail, his signature confident and steady across the tenant line. The same hand that forged my name on federal documents now signed his own name on a lease that put him under my authority. He had held out for nearly the full 30 days, which told me he had spent those weeks looking for a way around it and found none. Curtis's envelope arrived the day before. Helen opened it in front of me and placed the two signatures side by side on her desk. "Both signed," she said. She adjusted her reading glasses and leaned forward. "But look at Curtis's signature. Shaky, uneven. That's not his normal hand." She was right. Derek's name was written the way Derek did everything with force and certainty. Curtis's looked like it had been drawn by a man whose hand was trembling. The letters were unsteady. The pen had hesitated twice, leaving small pools of ink where a steady hand would have kept moving. "He signed under duress," Helen said. "That's going to matter later." I held both leases in my hands and felt nothing like victory. It felt like holding the x-rays of a disease I had not caused but was now responsible for treating. These were my son's signatures. The men who locked me in that house during a Category 4 hurricane now needed my permission to sleep there. The men who forged my name on federal documents were now tenants in a home they had tried to steal, paying rent they had never expected to owe, bound by a lease that did not include their wives. They locked me in my house during a hurricane. Now they needed my signature to stay in it. Helen filed both leases in the office safe. The metal door clicked shut with a sound that felt more final than any lock I had ever heard. "What happens when they miss the first payment?" I asked. Helen did not answer right away. She closed the safe, turned back to her desk, and opened a different folder, one I had not seen before. It was thicker than the lease file, and the tab was marked with a name I did not recognize. "Before we get to January, Trenda," she said, "there's something Tyler Briggs from the fishing board just brought me." She placed a stack of documents on the desk. Each one bore my name on a signature line. Each signature was in the same wrong handwriting, the same slant, the same looped G, the same careful imitation that was close, but never close enough. "Derek didn't just forge your signature once, Walter." I counted the pages. There were 5. 5 separate documents submitted to the fishing board over 3 years, each bearing a signature that looked like mine, but was not. License renewals, transfer requests, authorization forms. A paper trail of forgery so systematic it could not be explained as a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was a pattern. This was a profession. Helen looked at me over the top of her glasses. "Tyler held these back because he wasn't sure. Now he's sure. And when the board meets next month, these go on the record." Tyler pulled the first trap at 5:40 in the morning and told me, without knowing what he was doing, exactly when my son had planned to erase me. The forged fishing board documents were sitting in Helen's safe. The board meeting was 6 weeks away. But before any of that could move forward, I needed to keep doing what I had always done: fish. And Tyler, my 14-year-old grandson, who had Derek's jawline, but Dorothy's eyes, needed to keep learning how. We were on the Miss Dorothy in December, fog so thick I could barely see the bow from the helm. Tyler hauled traps the way I had taught him, steady pull check the bait, measure the catch reset. His breath came out in white clouds that disappeared before they reached me. He talked the way teenagers talk when their hands are busy and their guard is down. About school, about a girl in his math class, about something his father said. "Dad told Uncle Curtis the guardianship thing would be over by Thanksgiving," Tyler said. "He was pulling a trap over the gunnel, not looking at me. He said you wouldn't even know what was happening until it was done." The helm vibrated under my grip. The engine hummed. The fog pressed in from every direction. And my grandson, hauling lobster traps beside me at dawn, had just handed me the original timeline of my own erasure without understanding a single word of what he had said. By Thanksgiving. Derek had planned to have me declared incompetent before the turkey was carved. The guardianship was supposed to be finished, signed, sealed, and I was supposed to wake up one morning and discover I no longer had the legal right to decide where I lived, what I owned, or whether I could sell the house my wife died in. My 14-year-old grandson hauled lobster traps beside me and had no idea he had just handed me the timeline of my own destruction. And I let him keep pulling traps because some things a boy should never have to carry. "Tyler, how long until the next board meeting?" I asked. My voice was steady. I made sure of that. "Like 6 weeks, Grandpa." "Why?" "No reason. Let me show you how to read the tide chart." I spent the next hour teaching him about current patterns and tidal windows, the way my father taught me the way I taught Derek, before Derek decided the ocean was worth more as a selling point than a livelihood. Tyler listened the way good students listen, with his hands, not just his ears. He would be a fine fisherman someday if anyone let him be one. We came in around noon. I dropped Tyler at the dock, drove to the cottage, showered the salt off, and sat at the kitchen table with the thermos's coffee gone cold. Then I drove to Helen's office. January had arrived, and with it, the first rent payment. Derek paid. Late. 5 days late, to be exact. The check appeared in Helen's mailbox on January 6th, postmarked January 4th. The amount was correct. The timing was not. Helen was waiting for me with the check on her desk, and a look I had learned to recognize the look that meant she had already figured out what someone else was trying to do. "He's paying late on purpose," she said. Her pen clicked twice against the desk, the habit she had when she was laying out a trap someone else had set. "He wants you to send a violation notice, a formal complaint about late payment, so he can file it as harassment of an elderly family member. It goes straight into the guardianship folder." A trap inside the lease. Derek was using the rent I charged him as bait, hoping I would react the way an angry old man would react with a letter. A warning, a documented complaint that his lawyers could repackage as evidence of irrational, vindictive behavior. The late payment was not carelessness, it was strategy. Derek thought he was playing chess with an old fisherman who did not know the rules. But fishermen understand traps better than anyone, especially the ones baited to look like gifts. "So I do nothing?" I asked. "You do everything," Helen said. "You accept the payment, you issue a receipt. You say nothing, not one word, no letter, no phone call, no text. You take the money, you sign the receipt, and you file it." She opened a new folder on her desk. The tab was marked Receipts in red ink. Every receipt is a brick, Walter. We're building a wall. I signed the first late payment receipt that afternoon. Helen filed it in her system, dated and time stamped. One brick, the first of what would become many. Each one proving that Derek lived in my house, paid me rent, and depended on my property for shelter, while simultaneously trying to have me declared unfit to own it. The contradiction would become its own evidence. A man who pays rent to his father is a man who recognizes his father's authority. You cannot pay someone rent and then tell a judge that person is incompetent. The receipts would prove that. I picked up my coat and walked toward the door. Helen stopped me before I reached the handle. "One more thing," she said. I turned. Her voice had that careful weight it carried when something new had arrived. "Diane Lester called today. She's an investigative journalist with the Portland Courier. She's been reviewing property filings across the county for the past 3 years." Helen paused. "Walter, this isn't the first family he's done this to." I stood in the doorway with my coat half on and the office door handle cold under my palm. The words settled into me, the way cold water settles into the hull of a boat with a crack in it, slowly and then all at once. Not the first family. My son had not just done this to me. He had done it before. To someone else's father. Someone else's house. Someone else's name on a signature line written by a hand that was not theirs. How many fathers had sat across from a stranger and learned their son was not who they raised 3, as it turned out? Just in this county alone. Diane Lester was 44 years old, an investigative journalist for the Portland Courier who had spent 8 months tracking coastal property fraud along the Maine shoreline. She needed one victim willing to go on record. She found me at the Harbor Cafe on a January morning when the windows were fogged from the cold and the breakfast crowd provided enough noise to cover a conversation no one else needed to hear. She placed a thick manila folder on the table between us. Colored tabs marked each section. She opened it to the first page and turned it so I could read. 3 other families in 5 years, Mr. Gaines, she said. Different LLC names, same playbook. Manage the property forge, the papers force the sale. Your son isn't an opportunist. He's a serial predator. And you're not the first family that trusted him. She walked me through them one at a time. The first was a widower in Camden 81, whose beachfront cottage was transferred to an LLC he never authorized. The second was a retired couple in Owl's Head, whose fishing permits were reassigned through paperwork they never saw. The third was a man in Thomaston 77, whose coastal lot was sold to a development company 6 months after his wife's funeral. 3 families, 3 different LLCs, 3 different filing addresses. But Diane had traced them all back to the same registered agent, the same law firm in Portland, and the same pattern of forged signatures on documents submitted, while the property owners were grieving aging or both. You raise a child, and you think you know every version of them. The boy who cried at thunderstorms, the teenager who lied about curfew, the man who shook your hand at his wedding and promised he would take care of things. But you never imagine the version that sits in an office forging your name onto documents while you sleep. You never picture the man who looks at other people's fathers and sees inventory. Diane's coffee went cold. So did mine. She let me read at my own pace. She did not rush. She did not push. She sat across from me with the patience of a woman who understood that what she was showing me was not just evidence. It was a mirror. "How did you find me?" I asked. "Public filings," she said. The county assessor's office flagged your son's LLC activity because the same registered agent appeared on 4 separate property actions in 3 years. I started pulling threads. Your name came up last because your property hasn't transferred yet. The others already lost theirs. 3 fathers, 3 houses, 3 lives dismantled by a man I taught to tie his shoes and bait a hook and shake hands like he meant it. And not one of them had pressed charges. 3 families, 5 years. And not a single one of them had gone to the police because every single one of them was someone's father, and a father will swallow poison before he spits it at his own son in public. Will you publish before the board meeting? I asked. Diane shook her head. After, not before. I need it airtight, and I need you on record. On record meaning my name, my face. Your name, your story. The others wouldn't talk. They were ashamed. They thought it was their fault for trusting their own children. She closed the folder and set her hands flat on the table. You're the first one who isn't ashamed, Mr. Gaines. You're the first one who's angry. She was right. I was not ashamed. I had spent months collecting evidence, building a case, learning the shape of what my sons had done. I was not a man who had been fooled. I was a man who had been betrayed, and there is a difference. Fools do not fight back. Betrayed men do. I'll go on record, I said, after the meeting, not before. I want him to walk into that room thinking he's still winning. Diane nodded. She clicked her recorder off. She had asked permission at the start, and I had given it and slid the folder back into her bag. We shook hands. She left a 20 on the table for both coffees and walked out into the January cold. I sat there for another 10 minutes. The cafe filled and emptied around me. The fogged windows cleared as the morning warmed. I thought about the man in Camden, the couple in Owl's Head, the widower in Thomaston. I did not know their names. I did not need to. I knew their story. It was mine. I drove home to the cottage. Biscuit met me at the door, the way she always did, nose first, tail second. I hung my coat, put the kettle on, and turned toward the kitchen table. There was a package on it, no return address, just my name written in handwriting I did not recognize. The envelope was padded, the kind you buy at the post office for small items. It had been placed on the table, not mailed. Someone had come inside while I was at the cafe. I opened it. Inside was a USB drive, black, no label, and a single index card. The handwriting on the card was careful and even. Not Dorothy's, not Helen's, not Sadie's. Curtis asked me to get this to you. It's every file from Derek's home office. Play track 7 first. I turned the card over. Nothing on the back. But I knew the handwriting now. I had seen it on church potluck sign-up sheets and tourism board correspondence and the Christmas cards that arrived every December, signed with both names even when only one hand had written them. The handwriting was Patty's. Patty Ballard Gaines. The woman who had given Curtis an ultimatum. The woman who had lobbied the pastor against me. The woman who had threatened to take her children and leave if Curtis did not sign with Derek. That woman had walked into my cottage, placed a USB drive on my table, and written a note telling me to play track 7 first. Something had broken in that house, and whatever broke had sent Patty to mine. Curtis stood on my porch at 11 o'clock at night, with no coat, no car running in the driveway, and the look of a man who had walked the whole way here in the dark. Patty's note was still on my kitchen table. The USB drive she delivered sat next to it. But now the man who had asked her to bring it was standing in front of me, hollow-faced, unshaved, smelling like cold air and sweat, and the kind of fear that lives in a body for months before it finds its way out. I opened the door. He walked in without a word. I poured 2 cups of coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at his hands for a long time. I did not ask what happened. I waited, the way Dorothy would have. "I have recordings, Dad," Curtis said. His voice was flat, emptied of everything except the words themselves. From every meeting they made me sit in, Derek, Renee, everything. I didn't know how to stop them. I kept thinking it would stop on its own. It never did. He reached into his jacket and placed a second USB drive on the table next to the one Patty had delivered. 14 files, he said. Every planning session, every phone call he was in the room for. He had recorded them on his phone and transferred them to the drive the night before. "Patty brought you the office files," he said. "These are the meetings, my recordings, my phone." My youngest son handed me a USB drive like it was a confession, and a surrender rolled into one, and I took it, because a father accepts what his children bring him, even when it is proof of everything he feared. "Does Patty know you're here?" I asked. He shook his head. "I'm not going to lie for them anymore, Dad," he said. He did not look up. He set it to the table, to his hands, to the coffee he was not drinking. I should have said something the night of the storm. I should have said something on the porch. I turned around in the doorway, and I wanted to tell you, and I couldn't. I remembered that moment, the doorway, his mouth opening and closing, the car engine waiting. "Go home," I said. "Act normal. I'll see you at the meeting." He looked at me for the first time since he sat down. His eyes were red. He nodded once. Then he walked out the door into the January cold without a coat the way he had come. I picked up both drives and my car keys. Helen's office was dark when I pulled up, but the light came on before I reached the steps. She had been waiting. I do not know if she slept anymore. I do not know if I did. We sat at her desk with the laptop between us and played the first file, then the second, then all 14. Renee's voice came through the speakers, first tinny and precise the way voices sound when they are recorded through a phone sitting in a jacket pocket across the room. She was talking about the guardianship filing. "The guardianship is the cleanest path," she said. "Once it's filed, he can't sell, can't transfer, can't do anything without our approval. The cleanest path." She said it the way someone describes a surgical procedure, clinical efficient already decided. My daughter-in-law was discussing the legal erasure of my autonomy the way she discussed property listings. With strategy, with calm, without a single syllable that acknowledged I was a human being and not an asset to be managed. Track 4 was Derek's voice, calm and measured, explaining to Renee exactly how long it would take for the storm surge to reach the lower floor, and that by the time anyone checked on me, the paperwork would already be filed. He said it like a man reading a weather forecast. He said it like the rain was the point, and I was the inconvenience the rain would solve. Track 7 was Patty rehearsing what she would say to the pastor, word for word. She practiced the concerned voice. She practiced the hesitation. She ran through it twice, and on the second take, Derek told her to slow down on the part about threats because it would sound more believable. They directed her. They coached her. The church hallway performance was not spontaneous. It was scripted, rehearsed, and approved by the same people who locked me in a house during a hurricane. Helen played each file, labeled it, and placed it in a folder. She did not speak. She did not react. She listened the way lawyers listen when the evidence is doing all the work and commentary would only dilute it. By 1 a.m, all 14 tracks were cataloged. Helen arranged them in presentation order, alongside every other piece: the receipts, the forged documents, the camera footage, the valuation report, the journalist's file. She placed them all in a single presentation folder, thick enough now to stand on its own edge. She closed the folder and looked at me across the desk. "This is everything," she said. "This is more than everything." The office was quiet. The heater hummed. Reheated coffee sat cold between us. Outside, the January dark pressed against the windows like a held breath. "What do you want to hit them with first?" she asked. I did not hesitate. "At the storm," I said. "Always the storm first." Because that is where it started, not with the forgeries or the LLCs or the guardianship filing. It started with a man locking his father in a house and driving away. Everything else was arithmetic. The storm was the act. The storm was the thing a room full of people would understand in their bones before the lawyer in them had time to look for loopholes. Helen nodded. She placed the storm file on top of the folder. "The board meeting is at 9 a.m., she said. "Derek doesn't know about any of this. Are you ready?" I stood up. My coat was still wet from the walk-in. My coffee was cold. Biscuit was waiting at the cottage. And tomorrow, every truth I had been carrying for 4 months was going to walk into a room and sit down across from the man who thought he had buried them. "I've been ready since the water came through my front door," I said. The pastor was 3 sentences into his statement when I decided to let him finish because every word he read made the recording in my pocket more devastating. Pastor Glenn Whitfield stood at the podium in the Rockland County Planning Office like he was delivering a Sunday sermon to folding chairs and fluorescent lights. He spoke about Derek's character, his commitment to community development, a man who understood coastal property and wanted to honor his father's legacy. Patty sat in the second row, nodding along, lips pressed into the satisfied line she wore when she believed she was winning. I sat 4 rows back with Helen on my left and Curtis on my right. Helen's hand was on my knee not for comfort, but to keep me still. Earl Hobson and Nate Fielder sat near the windows. Diane Lester had the front row with a legal pad balanced on her crossed legs. Commissioner Farley Knox presided from the center of the raised table, flanked by 4 board members. Knox was the one with authority to suspend the permit transfer. Pastor Whitfield finished by calling Derek a man of integrity. Polite applause. Patty turned and looked at me with something close to pity. Knox adjusted his microphone. "Thank you, Pastor. Anyone else on behalf of the applicant? Up silence. Then we'll hear from the opposing party. Mr. Gaines, you have 15 minutes. I stood slowly, Not because my knees demanded it, though they did, but because I wanted every person in that room to watch a 74-year-old man walk to the front without assistance. The podium felt solid under my hands. Derek sat in the first row beside Renee, wearing a charcoal suit and a tie I had given him 3 Christmases ago. Commissioner Knox, members of the board, my name is Walter Gaines. I have fished out of Broken Harbor for 51 years. The property at 14 Osprey Lane has been in my family since 1974. I am not here to talk about sentiment. I am here to talk about what my sons did to keep me from attending this meeting the first time it was scheduled. The room went heavy with quiet. On September 14th, 2023, Hurricane Maren made landfall as a Category 4 storm. My sons Derek and Curtis Gaines visited my home the evening before and installed exterior padlocks on both doors. They boarded the windows from the outside. They left me locked inside a wood frame house on a coastal bluff during the most powerful storm to hit this county in 40 years. Someone in the middle rows inhaled sharply. Pastor Whitfield just called Derek a man of integrity. I would like to play a recording the pastor did not know existed. I pulled the phone from my jacket. Helen had loaded the file that morning. The speaker was small, but the room was smaller, and when Derek's voice filled the space between the walls, there was nowhere for it to hide. 94 seconds. Derek instructing Curtis on which hardware to buy for the padlocks. Derek saying, and I will never forget the exact words, "The old man won't call anyone. He doesn't even know where his phone is." Derek laughing. When the recording ended, Pastor Whitfield had turned the color of old milk. He looked at Derek, then the floor, then the exit. He did not leave, but his hands gripped the armrest like a man who wanted to. I have additional documentation. I opened the folder. A signed affidavit from Dr. Alma Cho confirming she treated me for hypothermia dehydration and a rotator cuff tear sustained breaking through my own kitchen wall to escape. Photographs of the padlock hardware still on my door, frames dated and notarized. Forensic analysis showing my signature on a $420,000 loan I never applied for, identified by 3 experts as a digital forgery. Witness statements from Earl Hobson and Nate Fielder, confirming Derek visited my property the night before the hurricane. Financial records showing loan proceeds deposited into an account controlled solely by Derek Gaines. I closed the folder. Knox leaned forward. His reading glasses caught the overhead light, and his eyes disappeared behind 2 white rectangles. Then he looked directly at Derek. "Mr. Gaines, Derek, would you like to respond?" Derek stood, buttoned his jacket, looked at the board members one at a time, searching for an ally, the way a drowning man searches for wood. The storm, Derek said, was not that bad. The silence that followed had teeth. Earl Hobson laughed one short bark he smothered with his hand. Nate shook his head. Diane Lester stopped writing and stared. Knox removed his glasses. The permit transfer for 14 Osprey Lane is suspended effective immediately pending full investigation. Additionally, this board is referring the forged loan documents to the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Maine. Patty grabbed Derek's arm. He shook her off. Renee stood, picked up her purse, and walked toward the door without looking back. The click of her heels on tile was the only sound until the door swung shut behind her. Derek sat down. Not the way a man sits when a meeting has gone poorly. The way a man sits when he realizes the ground beneath him was never solid, his hands flat on his thighs, jaw-locked eyes, fixed on a point past the back wall, as if he could see through the building to the harbor and the ocean that had fed him his entire life because I taught him where to set the traps. Diane Lester closed her notebook and capped her pen with the look of someone who knows exactly what she is going to do next, and it involves the front page. The sheriff's deputy arrived at 8 in the morning to supervise the move-out, and I realized I had never seen a uniformed officer stand on Dorothy's porch before. He was young, maybe 25, with a jaw that hadn't learned how to set itself yet. He kept his hands on his belt and looked at the ocean like a man who had never been paid to stand this close to it. I nodded to him from the driveway, and he nodded back. That was all either of us needed. Derek pulled up in a rented box truck at 8:15. No Renee. Word through Helen was that Renee had already left Rockport 2 weeks earlier, hired a private divorce attorney out of Portland, and listed the condo before the ink dried on the board's suspension order, the first member of that whole conspiracy to disappear, not out of conscience, but because the investment stopped paying. Derek stepped out of the cab without looking at me. He wore jeans and a sweatshirt I didn't recognize, which meant he'd bought new clothes since moving out of wherever Renee had left him. He walked past the deputy, past Helen standing near the garage, past Earl watching from his porch across the road, and went straight through the front door like a man retrieving luggage from a hotel he'd been asked to leave. I sat on the porch steps and let him work. The man who locked me in that house during a hurricane now needed my permission to carry his own furniture out the front door. I did not say this aloud. Some truths are louder when you let the silence carry them. He made 11 trips. Boxes of floor lamp, 2 suitcases of printer he'd set up in Dorothy's sewing room. Each trip he passed within 4 feet of me. Each trip his eyes went to the truck, the ground, the truck, never to my face. On the 9th trip, he paused at the threshold, and I thought he might speak, but he just shifted the box to his other hip and kept walking. Curtis arrived at 9 with Sadie in the back seat. He parked behind Helen's car and came over slowly, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders carrying a weight that had nothing to do with furniture. "I'd like to put Mom's room back," he said. I looked at him for a long time. Then I handed him the key to the bedroom. He went upstairs alone. I heard his footsteps slow, deliberate, the way you walk through a room you know you damaged. 20 minutes later, I followed him up. He had Dorothy's quilt spread across the bed, smoothing it with both hands the way a man lays flowers on a grave carefully, as if the act itself could undo something he didn't have the courage to stop when it mattered. Her reading lamp was back on the nightstand. Her bookmarks were still in the drawer where he'd found them. He had opened the window, and the February sea breeze was pushing out months of stale air, replacing it with salt and cold, and something that smelled like the beginning of a season. "I remember where everything goes, Dad," Curtis said without turning around. I always remembered. I didn't answer, but I stayed in the doorway until he finished. Outside, Derek's truck was gone. No goodbye, no last look at the house. Earl stood on his porch with his arms crossed and caught my eye. He shook his head once. That was his review of the whole situation, and I agreed with it. Sadie ran across the yard and wrapped her arms around my waist with the force of a child who doesn't understand what the adults have done, but understands that her grandfather almost wasn't here anymore. Her face pressed into my coat. Her voice came out muffled. "Can I still come fishing, Grandpa?" "Every Saturday," I said. "That never changes." Curtis loaded her into the car. He looked at me over the roof, opened his mouth, closed it, then drove away. The deputy signed his clipboard, tipped his hat, and left. The house was mine again. The next morning, I woke in the cottage to Biscuit's nose against my hand and a phone screen showing 53 missed calls. 53. From people who couldn't find my number during a hurricane, but discovered it the moment a newspaper article made them look bad. Derek's voicemail played first. His voice cracked in places it never cracked before. "Dad, please stop. Do not do this. We can still work something out. Please." Patty left 2 messages asking forgiveness in the tone of a woman who had practiced the word but never meant it. Cousins I hadn't heard from since Dorothy's funeral. A nephew who once told me oceanfront property was wasted on a man who just wanted to fish. I set the phone on the kitchen table and drank my coffee. First cup in months that didn't taste like strategy, just coffee, just morning. Then I opened the family group message, the one they'd used for years, to plan around me, and typed one text. I kept it precise. No anger, no flourish. The locked doors, the breaker cut, 48 hours alone in the dark during a Category 4. The first thing they said when they came back, "Is the roof still on?" I pasted the link to Diane Lester's article at the bottom. I added one line, "Read it or don't. I'm done explaining." I pressed send. Biscuit set his head on my knee. I scratched behind his ears and watched the screen. No reply dots, no typing indicator, no ping. Nobody replied. Some things are finally over. I set the phone face down on the table and listened to the cottage. Quiet in a way that didn't hurt anymore. The house across the road was empty now, and tomorrow I would call Helen about listing it on my terms at my price with every dollar accounted for. Dorothy's voice came to me, then clear as the morning she first said it. That house was never about the money, Walter. It was about making sure they couldn't take what we built and pretend they earned it. I signed my name 47 times that morning, and not one of those signatures was forged. Helen had the documents spread across her desk in 3 neat stacks, each page flagged with a colored tab where my pen needed to land. She clicked her pen between pages, a small patient rhythm that had become the soundtrack of every legal meeting we'd shared over the past 5 months. But this morning, the clicking sounded different, lighter, like punctuation at the end of a sentence instead of the middle. "It's 15% below market," Helen said, watching me sign page 19. "You're sure that house is going to keep people safe during storms? That's worth more than the difference." She set a brochure in front of me. The nonprofit was called Coastal Haven. The cover showed a renovated oceanfront property with reinforced storm shutters, a backup generator shed, and a kennel attached to the south side for pets. They took in elderly residents who lived alone on exposed coastline during hurricane season, People with no family close enough to help or family that couldn't be trusted to. I signed page 20. The Boston Resort Group had offered full asking price. A developer out of New Hampshire had gone 5% above. Helen had presented both offers with the professional neutrality she applied to everything, but I could tell by the way she set the Coastal Haven folder on top that she already knew where my pen was going. Dorothy would have liked this, Helen said. She suggested it, in the letter. Helen paused. Her pen stopped clicking. Then I'd say she got the last word after all. I signed the final page and set the pen down. The house that my sons tried to sell out from under me would now shelter strangers during hurricanes. And somehow that felt more like family than anything that had happened inside those walls for the past 2 years. Dorothy had seen this before I did. She always saw the right use for things, while the rest of us were still arguing about the price. Helen poured me the last cup from her office pot. It tasted lighter than any coffee we'd shared in that room, 5 months of strategy distilled into paper and wood polish, and a silence that finally meant something was finished, rather than something was coming. I drove back to the cottage with the windows down. February air in Maine has a way of cleaning out a car the same way it cleans out a house fast, thorough, and without asking permission. Biscuit met me at the door with his usual inspection of my shoes, determined that I had not been fishing without him, and returned to the rug. Nate Fielder's truck pulled into the driveway around 2. I heard the engine cut and the door slam and his boots on the gravel before he knocked. Nate was not a man who announced himself quietly. He sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee and told me everything that had happened since the board meeting, counting items on his fingers, like a man settling a bar tab. Derek's lawyer says the federal investigation could take a year. Maybe longer if they pull the bank records apart, which they will. 1 finger. Renee's already in Portland, divorce attorney. She filed before the article even ran. 2 fingers. Curtis lost the marina job. The board reported the $47,000 and the owner didn't want the liability. 3. Patty's off the tourism board as of last Tuesday. Unanimous vote. She didn't even show up to contest it. 4. He took a drink of coffee and put up his thumb. Pastor Whitfield stood up Sunday and apologized from the pulpit. Said he should have asked you first before reading that statement. Said he let friendship with Derek cloud his judgment. The whole congregation heard it. People ask if revenge feels good. I wouldn't know, because what I did wasn't revenge. It was bookkeeping, and the ledger finally balanced. Every consequence matched the crime it answered. Derek forged my name, and now federal investigators were studying his. Renee traded loyalty for equity, and the equity walked out the door. Curtis enabled the theft through a job that gave him access, and the job cut him loose. Patty used her public position to pressure the permit, and the public removed her from it. None of it was my doing past the moment I put the evidence on the table. The rest was gravity. Nate set his mug down and looked at me the way he looked at the water before deciding whether to pull his traps or wait another day. So how do you feel, Walter? Biscuit's breathing was steady on the rug. The cottage smelled like wood smoke and salt. Through the kitchen window, I could see the harbor and the masts rocking in the February chop, and the Miss Dorothy sitting at her mooring like she'd been waiting for months, which she had, like I want to go fishing. Nate laughed. Not a big laugh, the kind that comes when something is exactly what you expected and you're glad you were right. I walked him to the door and watched his truck disappear down the road. The cottage was quiet in the way I had learned to trust again, not empty quiet, but finished quiet. Biscuit was asleep. The coffee had gone cold. On the kitchen counter next to the sale paperwork sat a sealed envelope Helen had slipped into the folder without mentioning it. I hadn't noticed it until now. Her handwriting across the front read, Dorothy Gaines Education Trust, Final Structure. I picked it up. It was lighter than I expected for something that held the future in it. Dorothy had designed this before she died, the terms, the structure, the names of the only grandchildren who would ever benefit from what we built. I set it on the table next to my cold coffee and sat down. Some envelopes you opened slowly. The morning they hung Dorothy's name above the door of the house my sons tried to steal, I understood for the first time that she had won this fight before I ever started it. I opened the envelope the night before. Dorothy's handwriting on every page, the trust terms, the structure, the 2 names listed as beneficiaries, Sadie and Tyler, not Derek, not Curtis. The grandchildren only managed by Helen, untouchable by either son, until the last child turned 25. Dorothy had built a wall around their futures with the same precision she used to balance our household books for 40 years. I read it twice, set it on the nightstand, and slept better than I had in a year. The ceremony at the harbor was small, maybe 30 people standing on the dock in February coats with coffee in their hands. Commissioner Knox came down from Rockland and shook my hand with both of his, which was more than he needed to do, but exactly what the moment called for. "The board wanted you to know," Knox said. "The licenses are fully restored in your name. Nobody's questioning that again." I thanked him. He nodded and stepped back into the small crowd, and that was all either of us needed to say about the past 5 months. Helen stood beside me while I signed the charter for the Dorothy Gaines Maritime Safety Fund. The pen was heavy in my hand. The fund would provide emergency alert systems, temporary inland housing, and pet-friendly shelter for elderly fishermen during hurricane season. People who lived alone on exposed coastline, people whose families were too far away or too far gone to help. Nobody should have to ride out a storm alone because their family decided the house was worth more than they were, I said to the small crowd. I had not planned to say it, but Dorothy would have. Afterward, we drove to the house. The nonprofit had already finished the first round of renovations. Storm shutters, a generator shed the kennel on the south side. A brass plaque was mounted beside the front door. I read it aloud because someone asked me to, and because I wanted to hear her name carried on the salt air one more time. In memory of Dorothy Gaines, who knew what she was protecting and prepared accordingly. I built that house with her 46 years ago, and the best thing I ever did with it was give it away to people I will never meet, because Dorothy taught me that a house is only worth what it shelters. The resort group would have torn out the walls and put in a lobby. Derek would have pocketed the check and called it inheritance. But this Dorothy's name on the front of a building that would keep strangers safe during the worst nights of their lives, this was what the property was always supposed to become. I just needed her letter to show me. The crowd left by noon. Helen drove me back to the cottage. I spent the afternoon on the porch with Biscuit watching the harbor and not thinking about anything at all, which was a luxury I had almost forgotten existed. The alarm went off at 4:30 the next morning. I hadn't set a fishing alarm in over a year, but my hands remembered where the button was, the same way they remembered how to tie a bowline muscle memory from a life that predated everything my sons had tried to take from me. I dressed in the dark. Biscuit was already at the doortail, going nose pressed to the crack, like he could smell the bait from half a mile away. We drove to the harbor in silence. The road was empty. The sky was that deep winter blue that only exists before the sun decides to show up. The harbor looked the same as it did the morning after the hurricane, except this time, I was the one leaving by choice, with the engine running and the current ready to carry me out instead of walls holding me in. Biscuit ran down the dock ahead of me, paused drumming on the planks, and stopped at the Miss Dorothy's stern like he owned the boat and was granting me permission to board. Nate was already there, engine idling, 2 paper cups of coffee on the gunnel, steam rising into the cold air. "It's same heading as always," Nate said. "It's same heading as always." I took the helm. The wood was the same wood I had gripped for 30 years, smooth where my hands always landed, rough everywhere else. Nate cast off the lines. The Miss Dorothy eased away from the dock, and I let the current guide her toward the harbor mouth. As we cleared the breakwater, I looked back once. The safe harbor sat on the bluff where it had always sat, but the morning light caught the brass plaque, and Dorothy's name flashed gold against the weathered clapboard. And below, it walking through the front door with a small dog at his heels, was an old man I had never seen before. He moved slowly. He carried a duffel bag over one shoulder. He paused in the doorway and looked out at the water, the way I have looked at it every morning of my life, like it was the one thing that never changed its mind about him. I turned back to the open Atlantic. Dorothy always said, "The sea doesn't judge. It just moves." And after everything, the locked doors, the forged papers, the hurricane, the silence, the fight to keep what was mine, and give it to who deserved it, I was ready to move with it. The sun came up the way it always does out here, slow, honest, and without asking permission. I held my coffee. Biscuit sat at my feet. And the Miss Dorothy carried us forward the way she always had. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 51 years building something real, a home, a family, a life on the water. And I nearly lost all of it because I trusted the wrong people with the right things. I assumed blood meant loyalty. I assumed love meant safety. Do not make my mistake. Pay attention to who asks about your property more than they ask about your health. Watch who visits before the storm and who disappears during it. The lesson I carry now is simple. Protecting what you built is not selfish, it is necessary. The people who deserve your trust will never make you prove it from inside a locked house. And the ones who betray you will always tell you who they are long before the storm hits, if you are willing to listen. I believe God put me through this, so I could stand here and say it plainly, your home, your name, your legacy, those are worth defending. Do not wait for a hurricane to find out who is standing with you and who is standing over your paperwork. If this story hit close to home, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had family treat your kindness like weakness? What would you have done in my place? If you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. And if this is your first time here on Revenge Dad, subscribe so you do not miss the next story. Every story on Revenge Dad is a reminder that the truth has a way of catching up. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. This story on Revenge Dad includes certain details that have been adjusted for storytelling and reflection. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is coincidental. What matters is the message, and I hope it stays with you.